Evan and Lila had been dating since sophomore year, the kind of young love that everyone thought would fade but somehow only grew stronger. It was late summer, their last break before college, and they wanted one final adventure together before life pulled them in different directions. Lila had found a quiet camping spot deep within the forest, far from crowded parks or tourists, a place known for its beautiful lake and endless trees. Evan wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but he agreed without hesitation. For her, he'd go anywhere. They packed their small car with sleeping bags, snacks, a tent, and an old camera to capture memories. Lila loved recording everything. She wanted to post a small vlog of their farewell summer trip. On their way out of town, they stopped for gas and snacks, laughing as their friends waved them off. The two promised to be back Sunday evening for a movie night. No one imagined that promise would never be kept. As the car drove down the narrow forest road, the signal on their phones vanished. Evan joked about how they were off the grid now, and Lila filmed him making funny faces at the camera. The air smelled of pine and the world outside the car grew darker, thicker with trees. After 2 hours of driving, they reached the old dirt path leading to their chosen campsite. They parked near a clearing overlooking a small lake, golden in the fading light. Everything seemed perfect, peaceful, untouched, almost too quiet. The sun dipped behind the hills as they unpacked, setting up the tent while music played softly from Lila's speaker. She danced around with a flashlight, pretending to be scared of the forest shadows. Evan laughed, teasing her that she'd be the first one running if they saw a bear. She threw a marshmallow at him, recording every moment. That short clip, filled with laughter, light, and innocence, would later become part of a haunting mystery watched by millions. It was the last video they ever uploaded. The next morning, the forest was alive with the soft rustle of leaves and the call of distant birds. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting golden streaks across the thin layer of mist hovering above the ground. Lila was already awake, sitting by the lake with her camera propped on a rock, capturing the reflection of the sunrise. She looked calm, her hair tangled from sleep, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Evan joined her with 2 steaming mugs of instant coffee, the cheap kind they had grabbed at a gas station. He handed her one and sat beside her, the two of them wrapped in silence, watching the world wake up. It was their kind of peace, no notifications, no deadlines, no one to interrupt. Just the sound of the water lapping gently at the shore and the occasional crack of a twig under a squirrel's paw. Lila talked about her dreams, studying photography, traveling, maybe even moving to the city. Evan joked that she'd become famous one day, but deep down, he meant it. He told her he'd follow her anywhere. She laughed and said, "You can't even follow a map." That laughter echoed across the lake, bright and real, a sound that would soon haunt everyone who knew them. Around noon, they decided to hike deeper into the woods. Lila wanted to explore an abandoned ranger cabin she'd seen marked on an old map online. Locals said it had been closed for decades, but she was curious. She thought it'd make for a great photo shoot. They packed a small bag, left their tent zipped up, and marked the trail with pieces of bright orange ribbon so they wouldn't get lost. Evan filmed her pretending to lead a nature documentary, joking about wild forest creatures and hidden treasures. Hours passed. The sun shifted, shadows stretched longer, and the forest grew eerily quiet. When they reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, there was nothing, just the remnants of old foundations, covered in moss and roots. Lila frowned, disappointed, but Evan shrugged and suggested heading back before it got dark. She nodded reluctantly, snapping one last photo of the empty clearing. In that picture, later recovered from her camera, something faint stood between the trees, a blurred figure that neither of them had noticed at the time. By the time the last bit of daylight faded, Evan and Lila were completely disoriented. The forest had transformed into a maze of shadows, where every direction looked identical. The air was thick, damp, and cold enough to sting their fingers. Lila's flashlight flickered weakly as they stumbled through the trees, searching for any sign of the lake or their camp. The beam caught glimpses of branches, roots, and patches of fog that seemed to move when they weren't looking. Evan tried to sound steady, but his voice trembled as he said, "We just need to keep calm. The lake can't be far." Lila clutched her camera to her chest like a lifeline. "Maybe we should stay put," she whispered. "Someone will come looking for us." But the thought of spending the night in that silent forest, where every crack and whisper felt alive, was unbearable. They pressed on, guided only by the weak glow of the flashlight and the occasional flash from Lila's camera. The shutter sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing through the still trees. Around midnight, they stumbled into a small clearing, and froze. In the center stood something that looked like an old wooden cross, about 5 feet tall, roughly carved and bound with rope. At its base lay animal bones and what looked like melted candle wax. Lila's breath hitched. "Evan, what is that?" He didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and muttered, "We need to go now." As they backed away, the forest seemed to respond. The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the branches. Something cracked behind them, like a footstep. Lila swung her flashlight around, but there was nothing. The shadows stretched and twisted as if something moved just beyond the light's reach. She turned the camera on, whispering to it that they had found something creepy, like a ritual site. Her voice shook, her words rushed, barely coherent. Evan urged her to turn it off, but she refused. The camera was the only thing that made her feel in control. Then, faintly, over the wind, came a sound that made both of them freeze: laughter. It was distant, soft, and high-pitched, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. But it didn't fade. It came again, closer this time, followed by another sound, the slow, steady creak of wood. Evan pointed the flashlight toward the sound, and for just a second, they both saw it, a shape standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, still, watching. Lila screamed, and the camera dropped into the grass. The video later recovered from that moment ended with the flashlight beam trembling wildly, then a blur of motion as they ran, their panicked breathing echoing through the night. By the time the last bit of daylight faded, Evan and Lila were completely disoriented. The forest had transformed into a maze of shadows, where every direction looked identical. The air was thick, damp, and cold enough to sting their fingers. Lila's flashlight flickered weakly as they stumbled through the trees, searching for any sign of the lake or their camp. The beam caught glimpses of branches, roots, and patches of fog that seemed to move when they weren't looking. Evan tried to sound steady, but his voice trembled as he said, "We just need to keep calm. The lake can't be far." Lila clutched her camera to her chest like a lifeline. "Maybe we should stay put," she whispered. "Someone will come looking for us." But the thought of spending the night in that silent forest, where every crack and whisper felt alive, was unbearable. They pressed on, guided only by the weak glow of the flashlight and the occasional flash from Lila's camera. The shutter sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing through the still trees. Around midnight, they stumbled into a small clearing, and froze. In the center stood something that looked like an old wooden cross, about 5 feet tall, roughly carved and bound with rope. At its base lay animal bones and what looked like melted candle wax. Lila's breath hitched. "Evan, what is that?" He didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and muttered, "We need to go now." As they backed away, the forest seemed to respond. The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the branches. Something cracked behind them, like a footstep. Lila swung her flashlight around, but there was nothing. The shadows stretched and twisted as if something moved just beyond the light's reach. She turned the camera on, whispering to it that they had found something creepy, like a ritual site. Her voice shook, her words rushed, barely coherent. Evan urged her to turn it off, but she refused. The camera was the only thing that made her feel in control. Then, faintly, over the wind, came a sound that made both of them freeze: laughter. It was distant, soft, and high-pitched, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. But it didn't fade. It came again, closer this time, followed by another sound, the slow, steady creak of wood. Evan pointed the flashlight toward the sound, and for just a second, they both saw it, a shape standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, still, watching. Lila screamed, and the camera dropped into the grass. The video later recovered from that moment ended with the flashlight beam trembling wildly, then a blur of motion as they ran, their panicked breathing echoing through the night. By the time the last bit of daylight faded, Evan and Lila were completely disoriented. The forest had transformed into a maze of shadows, where every direction looked identical. The air was thick, damp, and cold enough to sting their fingers. Lila's flashlight flickered weakly as they stumbled through the trees, searching for any sign of the lake or their camp. The beam caught glimpses of branches, roots, and patches of fog that seemed to move when they weren't looking. Evan tried to sound steady, but his voice trembled as he said, "We just need to keep calm. The lake can't be far." Lila clutched her camera to her chest like a lifeline. "Maybe we should stay put," she whispered. "Someone will come looking for us." But the thought of spending the night in that silent forest, where every crack and whisper felt alive, was unbearable. They pressed on, guided only by the weak glow of the flashlight and the occasional flash from Lila's camera. The shutter sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing through the still trees. Around midnight, they stumbled into a small clearing, and froze. In the center stood something that looked like an old wooden cross, about 5 feet tall, roughly carved and bound with rope. At its base lay animal bones and what looked like melted candle wax. Lila's breath hitched. "Evan, what is that?" He didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and muttered, "We need to go now." As they backed away, the forest seemed to respond. The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the branches. Something cracked behind them, like a footstep. Lila swung her flashlight around, but there was nothing. The shadows stretched and twisted as if something moved just beyond the light's reach. She turned the camera on, whispering to it that they had found something creepy, like a ritual site. Her voice shook, her words rushed, barely coherent. Evan urged her to turn it off, but she refused. The camera was the only thing that made her feel in control. Then, faintly, over the wind, came a sound that made both of them freeze: laughter. It was distant, soft, and high-pitched, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. But it didn't fade. It came again, closer this time, followed by another sound, the slow, steady creak of wood. Evan pointed the flashlight toward the sound, and for just a second, they both saw it, a shape standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, still, watching. Lila screamed, and the camera dropped into the grass. The video later recovered from that moment ended with the flashlight beam trembling wildly, then a blur of motion as they ran, their panicked breathing echoing through the night. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out beneath them. The forest seemed endless. No matter how far they went, the trees pressed in tighter, swallowing every trace of the path they thought they'd taken. When they finally stopped, gasping for air, the night was utterly silent again. Not even the wind dared to move. Lila clutched Evan's arm, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What was that?" she whispered, barely breathing the words. Evan shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, just shadows playing games with them. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen it too, that figure, tall and motionless, staring at them from the trees. They decided to find higher ground. Maybe they could spot the lake, or at least some landmark. But every direction looked the same: black trees, endless brush, and the same carpet of damp leaves that muffled their every step. Their flashlight flickered again, the batteries running low. The darkness pressed closer, heavier. Lila tried to turn on her camera light, but even that began to fade. "Please, just keep talking," she said suddenly. "Don't stop talking, okay?" So he did. Nonsense words, memories of high school, stupid jokes. Anything to keep her calm, anything to drown out the silence that felt alive around them. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon something, a faint glow in the distance. Relief surged through them. Maybe it was their campsite, maybe another group of campers. They hurried toward it, tripping over roots, grabbing onto each other to stay upright. But when they broke through the brush, the sight waiting for them made Lila freeze mid-step. It wasn't their tent. It wasn't even a fire. It was a lantern, old, rusted, hanging from a branch above what looked like another small clearing. In the center of that clearing sat a single, torn sleeping bag and a half-collapsed tent. Both looked abandoned for years. Evan's flashlight swept across the ground, a metal cup, a rotting backpack, and beside it, something worse. A shoe, small, mud-caked, and not old. Lila's voice cracked as she whispered, "Someone's been here." Before Evan could answer, a soft snap echoed from behind them. Then another, closer. They turned, but the darkness was solid, impenetrable. And then came that sound again, the faint, childish laugh, drifting through the cold night air, circling them. Lila clutched Evan's jacket and whispered through tears, "We're not alone out here." Somewhere beyond the trees, something moved, slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. The branches swayed, and the lantern above them flickered once before going completely dark, plunging them into blackness. Lila screamed, and the camera clicked on instinct, capturing a single flash, a still image of Evan's face twisted in terror and, just behind him, the faint outline of something standing between the trees, its eyes catching the last reflection of light. The next morning came with a pale, gray light that barely cut through the fog. Evan woke first, though he couldn't remember falling asleep. His back ached from the cold ground, and his throat was dry, raw from breathing the damp night air. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, the figure, the laughter, the dark, until he turned to his side and saw Lila sitting upright, staring blankly ahead. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, the camera clutched tightly in her hands like she was afraid to let it go. Lila, he whispered, his voice hoarse. She didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she flinched violently and gasped, finally blinking as though waking from a trance. Evan, did you hear them? She asked in a trembling voice. Someone was walking around the tent last night. He froze, scanning the area. The fog was thick, curling around the trees, and the air felt colder than it should have been. There were prints in the soft dirt, faint, scattered, but definitely human. Too large to be either of theirs. They packed up what little they had left, a flashlight with nearly dead batteries, Lila's camera, and Evan's pocket knife. Their food was gone. Evan tried to rationalize it, saying maybe an animal took it, but even he didn't believe that. The food bag had been untied, not torn. Lila looked at him, her lips pale, and said softly, "They were here." As they began walking again, the forest seemed different. The path was uneven now, the ground soft and sinking beneath their boots as though they were walking through rot. The air smelled metallic, like rust or blood. Lila lifted her camera and began recording again, whispering into the lens about what happened, the laughter, the figure, the footsteps. She said it was proof in case they didn't make it out. Evan told her not to say that, his voice breaking slightly, but she kept filming. After another hour of wandering, they stumbled onto something that made both of them stop dead, their campsite. At least, it looked like it. The same small clearing, the same view of the lake, but everything was different. The tent was shredded, their bags were ripped open, contents scattered like someone had gone through them one by one. The marshmallow bag was torn, their clothes thrown into the mud. And on one of the tent's walls, carved deep into the fabric, was a single word written in shaky, uneven letters, "Stay." Lila's breathing turned ragged. "Evan, we have to go. Now." He nodded, backing away slowly. But as they turned to leave, Lila stopped. The camera light caught something near the tent, a figure standing on the opposite side of the lake. Too far to see clearly, but unmistakably human. It was watching them. The moment Evan looked at it, it stepped backward into the fog and vanished. They didn't speak as they ran. Branches whipped their faces, roots tripped their feet, but they didn't stop. Somewhere behind them, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps, matching their pace, never closer, never fading. Like the forest itself was chasing them. The wind howled through the trees as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the forest into a labyrinth of long, shifting shadows. The air grew colder, thicker, and it felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Emily clutched her flashlight tighter, the weak beam trembling as much as her hands. She glanced at the others, Mark, Sarah, and Jason, their faces pale and tense, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dying light. None of them had spoken since they found the torn piece of fabric hanging from a branch, the same pattern as the jacket Lily had been wearing when she vanished. Sarah broke the silence, whispering, "We should go back." Her voice cracked halfway through, barely audible over the wind. But Mark shook his head. "No, we're close. The trail can't just end here." His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed him, darting around, scanning every shadow as if expecting something to emerge. They pressed on, every step crunching against dead leaves that seemed too loud in the stillness. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees leaned closer together, their trunks twisted, bark scarred as though clawed by something large. Emily thought she saw faint markings etched into the wood, spirals, symbols, or maybe just scratches, but every time she blinked, they seemed to fade. The smell was different here too, damp and metallic, like old blood. Suddenly, Jason froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Everyone stopped. At first, there was nothing but the rustle of the wind. Then came the sound, a faint humming, almost like a lullaby, coming from deeper in the woods. It was the same tune from Lily's old music box, the one she used to play every night before she disappeared. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "That's impossible," she murmured, backing away. But Emily felt something inside her pull forward, an instinct or maybe desperation. Without thinking, she followed the sound, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she pushed through the underbrush. The others shouted for her to stop, but she didn't. The melody grew louder, clearer, as though it was calling her by name. When she finally broke through into a small clearing, the air changed, warmer, stiller, almost heavy. In the center of the clearing was a single, moss-covered tree stump, and on it sat the music box, spinning slowly on its own. The tune faltered for a moment, then stopped completely. The forest fell silent again. And then, from behind the stump, came the sound of soft breathing, not human, not animal, something else. Emily stood frozen in the clearing, her breath fogging in the cold air as the silence pressed down on her. The music box lay still atop the mossy stump, its final note hanging like a ghost in the air. Her flashlight flickered, and in that brief pulse of darkness, she thought she saw something move, a shadow, low and quick, slipping just beyond the edge of the light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She whispered, "Who's there?" But her voice cracked, swallowed by the weight of the night. Leaves rustled behind her. Emily spun around, her beam cutting through the mist to reveal Mark, panting, eyes wide with both relief and fear. "Are you insane?" he hissed. "You can't just run off like that." Before she could reply, Sarah and Jason stumbled into the clearing too, their faces pale. Sarah's flashlight trembled in her grip as her gaze fell on the music box. "That's Lily's," she said, her voice trembling. "How did it get here?" Mark stepped closer to the stump and crouched beside it. The box was old, worn at the corners, its silver paint flaking away. He hesitated before touching it, then slowly lifted the lid. The small ballerina inside began to spin, and the lullaby resumed, the same haunting melody. But this time, it sounded distorted, slower, warped as if the forest itself was singing through it. Emily's skin crawled. Jason whispered, "We should leave." But before anyone could move, the ground beneath them gave a low groan, like something deep below was stirring. The trees around the clearing seemed to shiver, their branches creaking and bending inward. Sarah screamed as one of the branches snapped and crashed beside her, narrowly missing her shoulder. The melody from the box sped up, frantic now, as if reacting to the chaos. Then came the whispering, dozens of voices, overlapping, circling them from every direction. Emily turned, trying to find the source, but it was everywhere, whispering her name, Mark's, Lily's. It was impossible to tell if the voices were inside her head or in the air. The flashlight beams danced wildly as everyone shouted at once. Jason lunged for the music box, slamming it shut. Instantly, the voices stopped. The forest froze again. Even the wind seemed to vanish. Emily stood in the stillness, her pulse thundering in her ears, and then she noticed something new, faint handprints on the stump, small ones, like those of a child, pressed deep into the moss. They were fresh. Sarah's knees buckled, and she whispered, "She's still here." The words hung in the air, trembling. Emily looked at the handprints again, and for the first time, she realized they weren't imprints at all. They were slowly sinking deeper, as if invisible hands were pressing down even now. The night had fully consumed the forest now, wrapping the group in a suffocating darkness that seemed to pulse with life. The faint moonlight struggled to reach through the dense canopy, leaving their flashlights as the only fragile barrier between them and whatever was lurking in the trees. Emily clutched the camera against her chest, its small red light blinking steadily, recording everything, even though part of her didn't want to remember any of it. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was breathing around them. Mark tried to take charge, though his voice trembled. "We're going back to the car. Now." His command barely rose above a whisper. No one argued. They started moving quickly through the undergrowth, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet echoing unnaturally loud in the still air. Every so often, a twig snapped somewhere off to the side, and Sarah would jump, gripping Jason's arm tighter. Emily stayed close behind, sweeping her light across the trees, and then she saw it again. Between the trunks, something pale darted across the path ahead. It was too fast to see clearly, but she caught a glimpse of long hair and a white sleeve. "Did you see that?" she gasped, pointing ahead. Mark turned his light that way, but there was nothing. Just the empty forest. Jason muttered, "Don't start that again," though his shaking hands betrayed him. Then the smell hit them, something metallic, mixed with decay. It grew stronger with every step until they reached the edge of the old campsite. Their breath caught as their beams fell upon the tent. It was collapsed and covered in dirt, as though it had been abandoned for years. The once bright blue fabric was now stained brown and torn open down one side. The fire pit beside it was cold, filled with ash and something blackened that didn't look like wood. Emily knelt down slowly, her hands trembling. She brushed away a layer of dried leaves, revealing the remnants of a notebook, the same one Lila had used in her camping vlog months before she and Evan vanished. The pages were damp and stuck together, but one still had writing visible, "Something's watching us." "It's not an animal." Sarah let out a choked sob, backing away. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. But before anyone could respond, the forest exploded with sound. The same eerie lullaby from the music box began playing again, but this time, it wasn't coming from behind them. It was coming from inside the ruined tent. Mark stepped forward, shaking his head. "No, it can't," He stopped mid-sentence as the tent fabric began to shift, as if someone inside was slowly standing up. The shadow that rose was tall, too tall, its outline distorting as it moved. The group froze, unable to scream or run. The lullaby grew louder, twisting into an agonizing pitch. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent again. The tent stood still, empty, but when they turned around, the path they had come from was gone. In its place was only the endless, breathing forest, and the faint echo of laughter, high-pitched and distant, fading into the night. Dawn crept slowly through the forest, but it brought no comfort. The trees looked the same in the weak morning light, tall, gray, and unmoving, yet something about them felt different, older, as if they had been watching all night. Emily was the first to wake, lying on the cold ground near the ruined tent. Her throat was dry, her body stiff with fear and exhaustion. The others were still there, Mark slumped against a log, Sarah curled up beside the ashes of the fire pit, Jason lying flat on his back, his eyes half open but unfocused. For a terrible moment, Emily thought he was dead. She crawled over and shook him gently. He blinked, slowly, and whispered, "I heard them again. The voices. They said my name." She didn't answer. She didn't want to know if he was telling the truth. The forest was too still, too quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of flies somewhere nearby. Emily stood up, clutching the camera that was still miraculously recording, its battery light flashing red. She turned it toward the tent and froze. In the daylight, she could finally see what they had missed in the darkness, handprints. Dozens of them, smeared in what looked like dirt but smelled like iron. They covered the tent's fabric, the ground, even the nearby tree trunks, all small, like those of a child. Sarah stirred awake and screamed when she saw them. Mark jumped to his feet, grabbing his backpack. "We're leaving. Now," he said, his voice hoarse. But the forest seemed to twist around them, the paths no longer matching what they remembered. Every direction looked the same. The trees seemed closer together than before, their trunks bending slightly inward as if to trap them. They walked for hours, or what felt like hours, but no matter how far they went, they always ended up near the same clearing, the same tent, the same burned-out fire. Panic began to sink in. Sarah broke down crying, clutching her necklace. Jason threw a rock at a nearby tree and shouted, "We're not supposed to be here." The echo came back distorted, like someone mocking his voice from deep in the woods. Then, faintly, the music box started again. But this time, it was far away, echoing faintly from every direction, like the forest itself was singing. Emily turned the camera in circles, her breath ragged. Through the lens, something flickered, figures between the trees, barely visible. She zoomed in, and her heart stopped. There was Evan, or what looked like him, standing motionless in the distance, eyes dark and hollow, his arm around Lila. Their faces were pale, lifeless, yet fixed in faint smiles. She blinked, and they were gone. Mark grabbed her shoulder. "We have to keep moving," he said. But Emily shook her head. "It doesn't matter. We're not getting out." Her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. She pointed at the camera screen. The footage was glitching, lines cutting across the image, but in between frames she saw something. The four of them, standing together, exactly as they were now, but behind them, countless shadowy shapes watching. The final moments were chaos. The footage showed flashes of running, screams, branches snapping, the camera hitting the ground. The last thing it captured was Emily's terrified face, whispering, "It doesn't want us to leave," before the screen went black. Months later, rangers found the campsite exactly as it had been, the same collapsed tent, the same music box on the stump, still playing softly. The camera was discovered nearby, half buried in the dirt. When authorities reviewed the footage, they refused to release it to the public. The search for Emily, Mark, Sarah, and Jason was eventually called off. The forest was closed to campers, labeled as unstable terrain. But locals still swear that if you walk too deep into those woods at night, you can hear laughter and a faint lullaby drifting through the trees, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, you'll see a flicker of light between the trunks, like a camera still recording.